Aloha, namaskar, and hello. Welcome. This is my show, Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and I am Anu Hittel, broadcasting live from ThinkTech Studios in beautiful downtown Honolulu. In this show, we go beyond outrage to talk about solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. You can join this conversation by tweeting us live here at ThinkTechHI. In today's episode, we will talk about rising sea levels and planning for it. What is the state of Hawaii doing about it? And we'll also talk about climate perceptions and psychology, what brought us to this point to start planning for sea level rise. And lastly, a really novel new idea for an alliance in the region, in the Pacific Basin, to deal with issues of sea level rise and other adaptation issues to climate change. So in the studio today, I have with me Sam Lemmo, administrator in the Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Nice to have you. And Sam is here. He is with the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources. And he has a background in biology, in environmental studies.
Correct.
And urban and regional planning, and has been working with the DLNR for 25 years?
Close.
Since 1991, correct?
Correct.
So welcome, and let's talk a little bit about sea level rise. And one of the things that I wanted to just start out with is that climate change has a big impact on the oceans. The oceans cover 75% of our planet. Ocean acidification, impact on fisheries, coral reefs, and of course sea level. Sea levels are rising, and this is something that all coastal countries are facing. Hawaii, however, is in somewhat of a unique situation to experience and address this issue. And at the Paris conference in December, we talked about, we saw how in the document, they acknowledged a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius to try and keep it below that, because even 1.5 may cause an existential threat to some low-lying islands, and this is something that we are trying to address even here in Hawaii with the low-lying Hawaiian Islands, right?
That's correct.
And so why would you focus on sea level rise? Tell us a little bit about that and how you got there.
Thanks, Anu. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today on Think Tank. And so essentially, my office is called the Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands, and one of our main functions, in addition to managing and regulating all uses of conservation land in the state of Hawaii, and that also includes our beaches and offshore areas. We're very much concerned about the resiliency in our coastal areas. And so I had the opportunity to get intimately involved in the issue of climate change recently, and I can back up and tell you a little bit about that and why we're now talking about sea level rise.
Yes, why did you decide to focus on sea level rise and not the other issues? Yes.
Well, the bottom line is, it's clear that the Earth is warming, and this has been scientifically established. In fact, we know that 2014 was the warmest year on record of 150 years of record keeping, and then we broke that record in 2015 by leaps and bounds. That's quite unusual and statistically improbable, but it happened. I've always felt that global warming is indeed occurring. Okay, but global warming has there's regional aspect to it. Some areas aren't warming as fast as others, and some areas are warming faster than others. For instance, when you see like the snowstorm in the Pacific Northwest in New York City on the East Coast, people say it's clear that there is no global warming is a myth, and that's kind of like the myth of climate change. It's like saying, because it's dark outside tonight, it's never going to be light again. But
right.
The reality is we do have regional differences in global climate, and that's going to continue in the future. So there's going to be winners and losers in the climate change issue. However, when we look at sea level, we see some very constant things. And with the exception of areas of the Earth that are rebounding from the last glacial period, like areas in Canada and Northern Europe, they're actually rising because all of the ice that was weighting them down in the past had melted, and so that they call it rebound.
So the land is rising.
Yes. So with the exception of these areas, most of the world is going to experience sea level rise over the next century. And so, and I wanted to, so we're pretty sure that sea level is going to happen, and so I wanted to kind of show a graph that kind of demonstrates the historical rate of sea level compared to the current rate, and then we can project into the future.
Yeah, so let's take a look at this and see what's going on here.
Yeah, this is an interesting graph. It's basically starts about 1900, and you see the blue line runs up to about 1990. That's all data based on tide gauges from harbors around the world. And so from the 1900, they determined that from tide gauge data from harbors around the world that sea level was actually rising. And the rate was 0.6 millimeters per year from 1900 to 1930, then it went to 1.2 millimeters per year from 1930 to 1992. And then if you look at about 1990, we put a satellite in space. And so for the past 20 years or so, we've been measuring sea level, average sea level change using altimetry from a satellite. It's very precise. And as you can see, from 1993 to 2015, we've had a 3.3 millimeter increase in sea level. And more recently, in the past 5-year period, we've seen yet another increase in the rate of sea level rise to 4.4 millimeters per year.
So now this is global mean sea level change. That
correct.
means worldwide, and sort of you're averaging out what the sea levels are. So in some places, we've seen more than the 4.4.
Oh, absolutely.
And in Hawaii, is that number different?
The Pacific's a very interesting study for sea level. You look up at Alaska, for instance, and Alaska's having, serious challenges with sea level rise, and that has to do maybe more with the temperature of the water. You look at the Western Pacific, the rate of sea level rise in the Western Pacific has been 3 times the rate globally. And in Hawaii, we seem to be kind of what I think is like a Goldilocks zone. Things haven't changed all that much in the past few decades. But with the onset of El Nino and different climatic forces, it's possible that not only Hawaii, but the west coast of the United States could start to see some serious increases in the rate of sea level rise. But it is variable. The ocean is not a flat surface as we all think of it as like in a bathtub. It's actually very, very contoured. And that's because of currents, winds. It's because of gravity.
Right.
There's many reasons why that's the case.
So what ended up having you focus on sea level rise, and what does that do? What are you projecting for Hawaii? What does it do for our state here? What are you thinking is going to happen?
First of all, I'd like to address your question, but I think I skipped one point in my opening, was that, why is sea level rise occurring? I think it's just really important that we understand that a lot of the fresh water in the Earth is locked up in continental glaciers and in Antarctica and in Greenland. These areas are experiencing rapid melting. And so all that fresh water is now running into the ocean, and it's causing sea level to rise. The other issue is thermal expansion of the oceans. Because the Earth is warming, the heat in the ocean is causing the ocean to expand, and that's increasing sea level rise. So I just wanted to state that for the record. Why we focused, the question again? I'm sorry?
Yes, why did we focus on sea level rise here in Hawaii, and why not, other aspects like ocean acidification or some of the other impacts?
Well, there are people talking about ocean acidification here.
Right. But your office is focusing on sea level rise.
And the reason for that is in 2014, the Hawaii State Legislature, the state of Hawaii, passed a bill called Act 83. And Act 83 is basically what we call Hawaii's climate change initiative. You know, it was the first time the state legislature and the executive branch of government got together and said, we want a measure that everybody can hold hands on and agree to so that we can address climate change and how it affects Hawaii. And so that measure went through the legislative process and it was ultimately approved. Well, because, you know, we've seen a lot of measures where people, you know, come into a situation and we all hold hands and we want to solve a problem, but it's difficult to focus on single issues. You know, we wanted to have a target. We wanted to be able to produce an outcome, a plan. And so we suggested to the legislature that we focus on sea level rise initially, and then move on to other aspects of climate change like acidification, like water supply, like invasive species, like public health. Impacts to public health from climate change. And so the bill basically said, we have a climate initiative, we want you to focus on sea level rise for the first 3 years.
Okay, so that's your legislative sort of mandate that's come down. And so what are you projecting? What, you know, what work has happened so far, and what kinds of maps and so on have you, I understand you've been working on that, so let's take a look at some of the maps that have come up.
Sure, why not? Why don't we go on to the next one?
To the next map.
The next
okay,
map,
this
correct.
One?
I like this one. Basically, what Act 83 asked us to do was to look at sea level rise. And so we basically put together a strategy, and we had to look at the science of sea level rise, right? We had to look at who we were going to reach out to in the state of Hawaii regarding sea level rise. And we had to then consider how we were going to put together a report on sea level rise. And so basically, this map is an example of the part of the science that we're working on. It basically is established, it basically creates these erosion hazard zones.
So what is the yellow and what's the red?
Yeah, okay. Let me get into that a little bit.
Okay. Actually, maybe this is a good time for us to just stop for a little bit and take a break here, but don't go away, because let's come back and talk about what does this sea level rise mean for Hawaii, and how did we get to this point where we're talking about sea level rise as a legislative act itself. So we'll see you then.
Aloha, I'm Rachel Jurgen with Aging with Grace. Please join us every Tuesday on thinktech.com.
Aloha, my name is Justina Spiritu, and I'm the co-host of Hawaii Farmers Series. This is my co-host, Matthew Johnson, and you can catch us every Thursday at 4 p.m. at thinktechhawaii.com. What do we talk about, Matt?
So on Hawaii Farmers Series, we're going to be bringing on the farmers and also supporter of farmers, including restaurants, caterers, as well as government supporters and nonprofits, to hear their background stories and understanding our local ag community just a little bit better.
Yeah, essentially there's a lot more that goes into farming and the local food community beyond just producing the food, and we want to feature and get the background story on all these folks and see how we all work together as a community. So join us every Thursday. Aloha.
Welcome back. You're watching Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and today we're here with Sam Lemmo, talking about sea level rise and what the state of Hawaii is doing about it. So we were about to, before the break, we looked at a map of projections and coastal hazards and so on, and so erosion hazards. So let's take a look at that map. Let's go back to that. And Sam, you were just talking about the yellow and the orange or red zones, and what does this map mean?
Right. As I said, this is one leg on a chair that we're trying to build, and this is the scientific portion. So you take the yellow line, for instance. Essentially what we've done here is we've mapped out erosion hazard zone. We have historical erosion data on which we can project future changes in the shoreline. So what we did is we took that projection and we added future sea level rise to that. And so that yellow line represents the location of the shoreline, perhaps, or the erosion hazard zone for 2030, which is 15 years from now. as you can see, it actually does look like the shoreline is recessing inland. And these maps are being produced by the University of Hawaii School of Ocean Earth Technology and Ocean and Earth Technology. Okay, so if you go to the red line, for instance, we've established what the shoreline location will look like in 2100, almost 100 years from now. And you can see, based on this map, a significant recession of the shoreline.
Wow.
Now, these just show the erosion hazards that might result from future sea level rise. We're also mapping what will happen with seasonal inundation, meaning what normal background waves will do at higher sea level stands. We're also looking at what the passive inundation is going to be, how the oceans, when the ocean rises, it's going to raise the ground table, and low-lying areas are going to be flooded. We're also looking at what the 100-year flood will look like under higher sea level stands.
So there's a lot of modeling work that's going on projecting what this is going to look like out to 2030, which is only really a few years from now, and then out to 2100. Now there was another map that we had, which maybe we could take a look at that one and see if that's part of the work that you were doing.
It's not.
Okay, well,
I can talk about this slide. This is really not part of our study, but what this demonstrates to you is what can happen when you have over 3 feet of sea level at a high tide. And this is like the Waikiki area. This is very dramatic, and
yes.
And it may be shocking for some people to view, but it clearly shows that a lot of the areas in the Waikiki, a lot of land in the Waikiki area is very low-lying and is very susceptible to increasing sea levels.
So this is an interesting, it says, see what a difference 3 feet makes. In the next 100 years, ocean levels are expected to rise 39 inches due to global warming. So, that's a lot, right?
Oh yeah, it's a lot, but the range, nobody knows exactly how much sea level will rise by 2100, or exactly how much it will rise. The problem is that it really depends much upon how much greenhouse gas we emit as a world, because what drives global warming is greenhouse gases, okay? And what drives sea level is global warming.
Right.
And so it's all interconnected.
Right. So let's take a look at some effects on Waikiki at this point. There's a video by the Pacific RISA program that they had put together. And let's go to that video now and see just what that looks like in 3D.
Sure.
My name is Michelle Galimba, and I'm a rancher in the Ka'u district of Hawaii Island. This is Kuahivi Ranch.
Okay.
It runs from...
Okay, it sounds like maybe we didn't have the right video, but we'll move on. And we kind of know what seawalls and waves crashing look like, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to move right on to asking you a question about how did you get to this point with, to this point where you're really looking at this has become a legislative priority to look at sea level rise, to put something together and to work on these issues as a state, right? And about a decade and a half ago, I would say that these things were not on the state's sort of radar, perhaps even. I haven't been here as long as you have, but at the state, so maybe that's something you can speak to. And perhaps the larger issue of just what kind of maybe climate psychology leads into all of these things. Now, the Yale project on climate change communications showed that in 2014, 63% of adults in the US thought climate change is happening. Okay, so that was 2014. And a Pew Research Center poll that led up to the COP21, that showed that there is global consensus that climate is a significant problem. So this was not always the case, right?
No.
And especially also here in Hawaii, I mean, this was not always the case where this was on people's radar. So, what has brought us to this point?
Well, yeah, interesting numbers on the Pew polls. As we all know, a lot of this is driven by media. Like 98% of scientists believe that climate change, that humans are affecting the climate, and that humans are causing the Earth to become warm. This is 98% of scientists. There are scientists that are climate doubters or look at the situation differently. The problem is when the media addresses this issue, they make it appear like it's a 50-50 argument. And I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps it's for ratings or to create the sense of discussion or conflict. The other issue is, and I'm going to point this out, is that our own leadership, in the government doesn't believe. I'm not talking about Hawaii. I'm talking about U.S. Congress. Doesn't appear to buy into the argument that humans are causing climate change, and therein lies another problem. And so, so we have some significant challenges to overcome to dispel the idea that climate change is a myth. But what changed in Hawaii is, I believe that we're in a unique spot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We're the only island state in the nation. We're highly susceptible to coastal change along our shores. We're susceptible to erosion. We're susceptible to flooding. We're susceptible to natural disasters. So people here are very very open to the idea of addressing these types of issues. And so, basically, it took many, many years to convince the general public, the industry, the legislature, the reigning governors that we needed to address the problem along our coast. And so that kind of led to the development of Act 83 and the passage of Act 83, and now us focusing on sea level because, to be honest with you, most of our state is in low-lying coastal areas. Our road infrastructure, our schools, our public works facilities, our communities, and so we have a lot at stake. We have a lot at risk. I think we should try to figure out what the effects of climate are going to be on these areas. And so that was a huge motivation to get people to agree to take this step forward.
So a lot of testimony on your part and part of other people and so on to talk to legislators and so on. Is that kind of how? Yes.
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 You spend a lot of time,
yes.
Knocking on doors and rattling cages sometime.
Yes.
And I think if you're persistent, you can get some things to happen.
So the larger issue of sort of climate psychology and people sort of it seems like the Pew poll is saying that yes, people think it's a significant problem globally. But here, 63% of the adults think that climate change is happening. But to actually get them to do something about it, that's a different story, right? And so is that sort of ingrained in our psyche in some way? And maybe taking a look at what sea levels through geologic time have done, or?
Well, that's an important point, and this delves deeper into the human psyche. There's a map or a graph that I refer to quite often. It's called a Post-Glacial sea level rise map. I don't know if you have it on tap here.
Yes, here it is.
We could look at it. Yeah, here it is. This really kind of opened my eyes, and this map basically demonstrates how rapidly things can change for human beings, because human beings were clearly around 20,000 years ago.
So what it's really saying is that 24,000 or 22,000 years ago, which is on the left-hand side of the graph, that sea levels were really low.
Yeah, 120 meters lower than they are today.
And then as you go up as you get closer to time, to our present time, which is 0 on that x-axis at the bottom, that you're really looking at sea levels now becoming to what state we know now. But they've fluctuated really from that 140 meters to what it is now. So things used to look a lot different 20,000 years ago.
Well, yeah, 20,000 years ago, we had hunters and gatherers, and maybe there was some people developing communities. The archaeology on human settlements is fascinating. But 20,000 years ago, from 20,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago, essentially people were running away from the shoreline. You have to think of it in those terms. These people had a firm understanding of climate change and geology and how things can change so quickly for them. You know, in fact, some even suggest that many of the myths that people talk about today regarding the great floods, you know, whether it was the Bible or Gilgamesh, are actually tied to things that really happened. You know, when the Black Sea failed.
And so the map, I mean, the graph that you just showed, that says something about in the past, 8,000 years, that sea levels have been fairly stable.
Yes.
And so perhaps that's something that we've just ingrained into our psyche, that we will always have stable sea levels and never really, they won't really be rising or falling. Is that part of your sort of thinking?
Yeah, Anu, this is the problem. About 8,000 years ago, it looks like, you know, climate stabilized somewhat, and therefore sea level stabilized, and they call this the Holocene period. Okay, a recent time, I think, is the definition for Holocene, or part of it. But what happens when you have stable climate and stable conditions? Things can evolve. You know, things can flourish, whatever it may be. It could be plants or animals, and you know what? Humans flourished during this time.
And he had stable agriculture, and
we were able to develop stable agriculture,
right.
stable communities. Relationships. We began to start the foundations of government, of politics, of art, of religion. Everything we know today is based on how we've evolved through the Holocene period. And for most people that live today, we're genetically encoded to think that we live in a stable climate. It doesn't change. That's why it's so difficult for people to embrace the idea that just because it's been stable doesn't mean that it's always going to be stable. And in fact, it isn't stable. It's already beginning to change. And you hear the reports day in and day out that climate change is no longer something that's going to happen in the future. It's upon us.
It's happening now. And this is what's so interesting, that why is it so hard for people to deal with this issue and to understand that immediacy of this issue, right? So despite warnings from scientists and environmental experts that limiting the effects of climate change means that humans need to make some changes now, there was an American Psychological Association's task force on the interface between psychology and global climate change. And it said that there are numerous psychological barriers to blame. They had quite a few listed, and I picked out 3 of them. One was uncertainty, which is that research has shown that uncertainty over climate change reduces the frequency of green behavior. So this is uncertainty being construed more as doubt, rather than the scientific way of, you know, talking about uncertainty. And then mistrust, which shows that most people don't believe the risk messages of scientists or government officials. So I'm sorry to say, but it sounds like most people they mistrust the messages that you're putting out there. And denial. So a substantial minority of people believe that climate change is not occurring. So that's a minority, but even so. And you know, I think that's a really interesting issue about about whether people are, you know, are they genetically programmed, and if so, even if they are not, but in any case, they're still mistrusting messages, they're not believing in this, and so that affects how they're going to act now, right?
Sure.
And so as part of that, I'd like to sort of wrap up this segment, but when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about how we can deal with some of these issues, and a really interesting idea that you have about what can happen in the region to address climate issues. So don't go away, we'll be back.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard. I'm the host of Center Stage here on Think Tech Hawaii. I hope that you will tune in and watch the show. It is inspiring and uplifting and educational also. We talk with artists of all different ilk. We talk with them about what they do, how they do it, and most importantly, most dear to my heart, why they do it. And it never ceases to be fascinating when you get the answer to that question. I hope you'll join us on Center Stage, 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoons. Aloha.
Okay, I'm Jay Fidel, that's Ray Starling. We co-host a show called Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. It's really interesting. You know, Ray has a way of unzipping these guys. He asks them these questions and all this stuff tumbles out, and we find out stuff we would never know about without Ray's questions. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, Jay. I'm very pleased to be your Ed McMahon every Wednesday at 4 o'clock here on the internet. So you can join us and see what's happening in the energy world, and there is a lot going on. So join us every Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, come around, be energized right here on Think Tech. Aloha.
Mickey Mouse. What do we do? What do we don't? Welcome back to Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and I have Sam Lemmo with me talking about sea level rise issues and planning in the state of Hawaii. So welcome back, Sam.
Thanks, Anu.
And let's talk a little bit about our, you have some very interesting ideas about the upcoming World Conservation Congress that is going to be held here in Hawaii. And it's something that happens every 5 years, is that correct?
4 years.
4 years, every 4 years. Yeah, it's the elections that happen every 5 years, right? So, all right. So imagine that. We've got the elections and the World Conservation Congress here this year. And the Olympics. Okay. So, wow, this is blowing my mind. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the Conservation Congress and what that means for perhaps some of your ideas about a larger Pacific Basin initiative.
Well, you know, the Hawaii is hosting the World Conservation Congress in Honolulu in September. And it's, as you know, one of the biggest conservation events in the world. And, you know, dignitaries from 160 countries will be descending upon Honolulu. They're expecting as many as 8,000 people to attend this. It's basically, you know, about the conservation of nature. One of the big themes that has, you know, come out of the past few years, and I can just talk about Paris real briefly, but is that we need to think about resiliency, and we need to think about the effect that we're having on the lithosphere and the Earth with respect to our emission of greenhouse gases. And so our actions are changing the environment, having an effect on conservation. So I think the Conservation Congress wants to think about climate change as one of its major themes. And
what did you mean when you're saying we need to think about resiliency?
Well, resiliency in climate change, there's terms of art. One of them is mitigation. One of them is resiliency. One of them is adaptation. Mm-hmm. Mitigation is taking actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like shifting from fossil fuel to renewable energy. And then resiliency and adaptation is figuring out ways to adapt to the changes that are surely coming in such a way that it will lessen the impact on us. So for instance, let's look at some of the Pacific Islands that are low-lying. Sea level rise obviously is going to have a major impact on several of these countries, to the point of if it goes too high, it can result in them losing their country. You know, what is the obligation to help them, or what are they planning to do to try to help their own people?
Now, these are things that are being addressed, or were addressed at least in the Paris Agreement, some of these things. Are you saying that some of this should also be taken up at the World Conservation Congress?
I believe that we're in a unique opportunity hosting it in Honolulu. We're in the center of the Pacific Basin. We have the island states, we have the 4 coastal continents, and we all have similar issues, right?
So let's just take a look at that map of the Pacific Basin, and so we have something in front of us. There we are.
Yeah. No, that's an erosion
There we
map.
go.
Okay, that's the Pacific Basin.
There we go. There's the Pacific Basin. And so one of the things, let's see. So we're looking at 4 continents, 4 continents.
4 continents.
I can't count. And a lot of islands.
Yeah.
And so your thought is that maybe this is what you're calling the Pacific Basin, right? Rather than Pacific, that means the rim as well as the islands in there.
Yeah, Pacific Rim is more like the Ring of Fire, but I'm looking at it as the Pacific Basin, the coastal areas of the continents, and then all of the islands in between. And the idea is, you know, in the wake of the Paris summit, COP21, where, you know, they developed a climate agreement, you know, why don't we look at some sort of like regional Pacific climate agreement or climate alliance that we can come, you know, we can all get together and hold hands and try to find out ways to be more resilient in the face of climate change. And so I think that, you know, the WCC the World Conservation Conference offers an opportunity, because people are already going to be here, to begin this discussion. If you know, should we want to choose to go down that road.
That's right. And you know, I like the idea of the nations that are bordering this ocean should work with work together on this, because normally, you know, we talk about the Pacific Rim countries, and then we talk about the island countries. We talk about those things separately. We don't usually involve the islands and those Pacific Rim countries all at the same time. And I like the idea of maybe we could just show this really quickly. Looks like first we have a little tweet here, our first tweet ever, and it says, it's from Sachi Ko, and it says, is sustainability expanding from a movement into an industry? Is there a benefit to this? If so. And sustainability expanding from a movement into an industry. Yes, that sounds like an interesting question. And do you have a, I see you nodding over there. Is there I mean, I know we're not quite talking about sustainability in this program. It's more, you know, but it is related.
Sure.
So.
No, I mean, well, I can speak to the part of sustainability that has to do with adapting or mitigating for climate change, and it is becoming an industry. I mean, look at the green industries that are developing that reduce waste, that use more efficient fuels. There is a total industry developing based on sustainability.
And is this a good thing?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We should promote it, but
yes.
you know, I also submit that, you know, we need to go further. You know,
yes.
we need to not just recycle. You know, not just use carbon scrubbers on smokestacks. We need to really delve deeper into the issue and kind of look at the whole issue of our basic consumption habits and how we view nature.
Yes. And actually, in that on that topic, I just wanted to mention, it kind of ties back to our climate psychology and those issues. I was just playing around with this idea that, well, you mentioned that, you know, for the last 8,000 years we've got this stable climate and stable sea level and so on, and it's just not in our genetic makeup. It also, I think, in general, is just related to time frame, right? So as a planner, you're talking about a time frame like 2100, right. And for a politician or for even a normal human being, even if you're not a politician, that it's, you know, that's way in the future. I mean, by 2100, everyone sitting in this room will probably be dead, yes. Unless some other miracle happens. But so, you know, one thing I did was I like to ask people, and this is something that people could also tweet in if they wanted, is can you remember an event in your everyday life where something has changed, some patterns, not just one thing, not an event like a big one, like a tsunami or something, but just, for example, I know that my children, when growing up in Missouri, the last few winters, they just haven't had as many days where they can sled in the snow in those winters. So I'm just wondering, are there, you know, it's just related to time frame, if we related to people's everyday lives, that every winter I used to skate on a frozen pond in Delaware. A friend of mine, Kathy, who now lives in Maryland, says I used to skate on frozen ponds in Delaware, and now it almost never happens. I have a friend in California who just wrote to me yesterday and said, Kirsten said, well, our apple tree in our backyard, over the last 20 years, our apple tree has stopped producing fruit because the winters just aren't cold enough. And so I just wonder, you know, about some of these, I know these are anecdotal in the sense that you can't really, this is not science data, but certainly does it help people sort of relate to things that change?
Yeah, I mean, living in Hawaii, you know, we kind of live in a Goldilocks zone. It's really hard to differentiate, you know, changes from one day to the next because our climate is so stable most of the time. And I've been here for 25 years, but
even in Hawaii, there have been changes such as trade wind days have decreased and things like that. They're seeing these patterns, right? That perhaps summers are a little wetter and warmer and winters a little drier. Now, of course, some of it gets confused by the El Nino Southern Oscillation effects, right? But
no, absolutely. Where there are other places, you know, there are other places though where I think these types of changes are very pronounced. The East Coast of the United States, for instance, has been observing, you know, higher sea level stands consistently, you know, for the past couple of years. Very at a frightening level, running more than a foot above normal. That is totally abnormal for that area of the world. So there would be something that people could see that has changed.
Right. And so I would say that maybe even relating this to everyday experience, even though it is anecdotal evidence, that maybe that is something that helps people realize that, yeah, things are changing and there's no denying it.
I think what you're saying is, take notice of your environment, your surroundings, and try to observe this as any major changes that you can,
yeah, and
even if anecdotally can, see taking place.
That's right, and I think that helps people understand that there is change happening and that there are, thanks to efforts like yours and what's happening in the state of Hawaii, that those are things that are being addressed and people have been working on these issues for a long time. It's just that now we're really getting some momentum with an actual legislative act, and then possibly going into the World Conservation Congress, trying to get some bigger commitments, perhaps, where we can have a more regional focus on this issue, maybe even garner some funding and all of those things for recommendations that you folks would put together. And in all of this, I just wanted to sort of thank you to bring us to this point and to bring us to the point where we can be talking about these issues. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for joining us, and we hope to continue to get updates from you. So we will be keeping our eyes on the Interagency Climate Adaptation Committee's works. So thank you, aloha. See you next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Aloha and goodbye.
Thank you.